The alarm screamed at 2:45 in the morning. I slapped it silent and muttered a curse under my breath as I dragged myself out of the cold bed. Every muscle in my body ached, as if I had been beaten all night. The day before, I had just finished a 16-hour shift at the Seattle Emergency Veterinary Hospital, and now I was about to begin another double shift because Dr. Lucas had suddenly called in sick with the flu. Diabetes didn't care whether I was exhausted or not. I stumbled into the bathroom, checked my old glucose meter, and cursed softly. The reading was below the safe range. Coffee first, insulin later, and breakfast once again would be skipped, because I was always late. The streets were soaked, reflecting a blur of amber lights as I drove toward the hospital. November in Seattle meant sudden cold rains and unpredictable blood sugar crashes. I had learned to deal with both poorly. My phone buzzed at a red light. A text from the head vet, Dr. Linda Chambers, the closest thing I had to an older sister. A Labrador had been hit by a car. Emergency surgery needed. Can you stay? I sighed without hesitation. No matter how tired or dizzy I felt, I knew my answer would be yes. Not because anyone forced me, but because I didn't know any other way to live except to keep working, keep healing. Even when I was trembling from hunger and cold, I would still place a fragile animal's life above my own comfort. Every time I told myself I'd stop, rest, slow down, but I never did. It had become an old habit, a silent promise I'd tied around my heart since the day I watched my first dog die in my hands as a freshman. I reached the clinic just as the rain began to fall harder. Raindrops drummed against the car roof as I rushed inside. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. My hands trembled as my blood sugar dropped to a dangerous level. But I kept stitching veins, fixing fractures, anchoring tiny hopes into that small, broken body. When it was over, I looked at the clock, nearly 6. A poisoned stray cat was brought in right after. I had no time to breathe. The sounds in the ER blurred, muffled by exhaustion. I took a sip of water, trying to stay conscious. The shaking spread through my arms and legs. My head spun, ears ringing. I don't remember leaving the hospital, only that by the time I stepped outside, rain was slashing against my face. I didn't plan to go home. I just couldn't stay there another second. I walked aimlessly through empty, flooded streets. Seattle at dawn had few people, and I, drenched in rain with muddy shoes and hollow eyes from sleeplessness, must have looked like a ghost. I stopped at the corner of 3rd and Marion, where the red light blinked mockingly. Then everything went black. The street, the rain, the wind, all melted into a dark blur. I saw nothing else, except one fleeting thought before I collapsed onto the freezing pavement. I shouldn't have left the hospital. Then darkness swallowed me whole. Between the moment the exhausted veterinarian collapsed in the rain and the one when she woke in an unfamiliar house under the watchful eyes of a stranger, if you felt your heartbeat slow for just a second, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can bring you more emotional, dramatic, and surprising stories every day. Before we move on to the next part where the strange connection between these two souls begins to unfold, let us know where you're watching from. Comment your city or country below so we can see how far this story has traveled around the world. We can't wait to read your thoughts in the comments. The first thing I felt when I woke up was warmth, something that shouldn't have existed on a freezing Seattle morning after I had fainted on a rain-soaked sidewalk. A faint scent of leather mixed with wood and a trace of mint reached me before consciousness did. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling above me was pale gray, dashboard lights glowed softly, and a man's profile came into focus at the wheel. I had never seen him before, but every instinct in me tensed, even as I realized one thing. I was being driven somewhere, in a luxury car, by a stranger. His voice was deep, steady, and a little cold when he glanced toward me. "You're awake." It wasn't concern, but confirmation. I pressed myself back against the door, fingers clutching the strap of my bag, eyes scanning for a way out. He lifted his right hand slightly, a calm, non-threatening gesture, yet firm. "Don't panic. You collapsed in the street. I couldn't just leave you there in the rain. My name's Matthew." His eyes returned to the road, his tone unchanging. I realized I was trembling, not only from fear but because my blood sugar hadn't stabilized. I whispered reflexively, "I need insulin and food." Matthew said nothing for a moment, then turned onto a cobblestone lane lined with tall pine trees swaying in the wind. The iron gate opened automatically, revealing a modern, elegant house on a slope overlooking the lake. My breath caught. Things were spinning out of control. He helped me inside, touching only my arm when I nearly collapsed on the steps. The air inside was warm, soft light spilling from a crystal chandelier hanging high above. A middle-aged woman, probably the housekeeper, appeared instantly with a towel and a worried look. At Matthew's nod, she brought a glucose meter, a tray with juice, glucose tablets, and some toast. I stammered, "Why do you have all this?" He didn't answer right away. Sitting across from me, fingers interlaced, he studied me as if deciding how much to reveal. "Someone close to me has the same condition. I know what low blood sugar looks like, and I know that if I hadn't acted fast, you might not have woken up." Warmth slowly crept back through my body as the sugar dissolved on my tongue. I looked at him more closely. He wasn't young, maybe mid-30s, with lightly tanned skin, deep gray eyes, classic sharp features, and a composed stillness that made him both intriguing and intimidating. I asked quietly, "Why were you there? Right at that moment?" He shrugged slightly, as if it didn't matter. "I was passing by. I don't usually, but it was raining. I couldn't sleep. I took a drive and saw you collapse near the light. No one stopped, not a single car. I couldn't leave you there." Silence settled between us, not heavy, but uncertain. I hesitated, unsure whether to thank him or question him. Finally I whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, stood, and said, "When you're feeling better, I'll take you home. Don't worry, you're safe here." Then he left me there, with a warm glass of juice in my hand, my breathing slowly steadying, my heart still unsteady. In that moment, I wasn't sure what frightened me more, the fact that I had nearly died from low blood sugar, or that a mysterious, composed man had saved me so precisely, as if he had done it many times before. I couldn't tell when I drifted off. All I knew was that daylight had already crept through the heavy curtains, spilling softly across the high ceiling with its exposed, dark, stained beams. The bed beneath me was cloud-soft, covered with a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of clean fabric softener, fresh, comforting, and unfamiliar. For a fleeting moment, I forgot where I was. Everything was unnervingly still, broken only by the chirping of birds outside and the faint trickle of water somewhere within the house. As clarity returned, I sat up slowly, my head still light. On the bedside table rested a small silver tray with a glass of water, a few biscuits, and a handwritten note. The penmanship was neat and slightly slanted. "You are safe. If you need anything, ring the bell beside the bed. I'll return this afternoon. Matthew." I set the note down, a strange mix of gratitude and caution rising within me. Something about all of this felt off, though I couldn't name what. I swung my legs over the bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and shivered. The room was spacious, its light-colored wooden walls and minimalist decor exuding a quiet, refined warmth. A row of black and white photographs lined the hallway wall, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, a navy armchair near the fireplace still carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke. All of it immaculate, almost too perfect, as though preserved for someone who might return someday. I stepped into the hall. The house was larger than I had imagined, its carpeted corridors leading to wide glass doors that opened toward Lake Washington, veiled in morning mist. The scene outside looked like a watercolor, beautiful but cold. Following the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet, I found the kitchen, where the middle-aged woman from the night before stood by the stove. She turned at the sound of my footsteps and smiled softly. "Good morning, Miss Thompson. I'm Martha, the housekeeper here. Matthew asked me to prepare something light for you. Did you sleep well?" I nodded faintly, uneasy that a stranger knew my name. Sensing my hesitation, Martha added gently, "He found your wallet when he brought you in. Don't worry, everything's still there." I wasn't sure whether that made me feel more relieved or more uneasy. Still, I sat at the walnut dining table and accepted the warm cup of coffee and a slice of toast. Martha didn't pry, moving quietly around the kitchen, leaving me space to think. I glanced around, looking for traces of the man who had saved me. Every detail of the house spoke of deliberate order, minimalist yet expensive art, furniture that balanced modern lines with classical touches, a sense of cleanliness without sterility. Each object, each placement hinted at someone private, meticulous, and unwilling to let others trespass into his world. After breakfast, I wandered into the living room. Shelves were filled with old volumes of history and philosophy, a few Italian books, and on the low table lay an unused cigar tray and a vintage mechanical watch. This was no ordinary man. He knew exactly how to act in a medical emergency. lived in a home that looked torn from an architecture magazine, and seemed to maintain control over every inch of his surroundings. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I wasn't used to being taken into a stranger's home, knowing nothing about him beyond a name. Yet there had been nothing predatory in his behavior, only precision, restraint, and an unsettling calm. Too perfect, too quiet, too safe. A kind of safety I had never known. I sank into the chair by the window, watching sunlight begin to break over the lake. Inside me churned a quiet storm, gratitude colliding with the wary instinct that had kept me alive through years of night shifts in the emergency ward. I didn't know who Matthew truly was, or why he had helped me with such composure, but I was certain of one thing: this would not be the last time I saw him. Even through my exhaustion, my intuition whispered that he was not someone I could simply walk away from, not after that night, not after the way he looked at me without a single word. I left the house in the late afternoon, under a sky the color of ash and a wind that had turned colder. Matthew wasn't there when I awoke, and he hadn't returned by the time I left, but Martha handed me a small paper bag and said he had arranged a car to take me home. He said, "You don't need to rush to thank him," she told me, and her gentle smile made me feel as if I were stepping out of a strange dream. On the drive back, I opened the bag. Inside was a small navy blue box, simple, elegant. When I lifted the lid, I found a medical device I knew well, though this one was far more advanced than the one I used. A continuous glucose monitor with skin sensor, the newest model, no daily finger pricks required, fully phone synced with low-sugar alerts. My breath caught. It was the very device I had been saving for over 6 months to buy, still short of the cost. Beneath it lay a note in the same handwriting. "I don't like watching people struggle with something that can be controlled. I hope this makes things easier for you. Just a gift. No reply needed." I closed the lid, heart pounding. No one gave such an expensive medical device to a stranger out of coincidence. It was a continuous glucose monitor. The most expensive, advanced thing I could ever dream of. He couldn't have known I'd been longing for one. The next day, I returned to the hospital with mixed emotions. Things were as usual, a few minor surgeries, a cat with a bone stuck in its throat. I tried to stay focused, yet every ring of the phone, every tall figure passing by made my pulse jump. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe a message, a visit, or a chance to return the gift. I had never been good at owing anyone, especially something of value. Then, close to midnight, as I was washing my hands to leave, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered. His voice was steady, clear, and calm, as if this were the most natural conversation between two people long acquainted. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he said, "but I'd be glad if you'd join me for dinner tomorrow evening. Not to say thank you just because I thought you might not refuse a proper meal after these past few days." I hesitated for a moment, surprised by how easily my answer came. "All right," I heard myself say, as if someone else were speaking through me. He chuckled softly, a low sound that made me tighten my grip on the phone. "I'll have a car sent for you. 6 o'clock. Don't make a big deal out of it," I added, half teasing. "I'll try," he replied. The call ended, but my heart kept fluttering. I didn't understand why I'd agreed so quickly. Maybe it was the calm in his tone, the patience without pressure, or simply that I had felt something the moment I woke in that car, a wordless, inexplicable pull. For the first time in years, after endless hospital shifts and mechanical days, I felt as though I were stepping toward something unknown, perhaps dangerous, perhaps not, but undeniably different from the quiet exhaustion I had known. I didn't know who Matthew truly was, but I knew one thing. He wasn't someone fate had sent for me to meet only once and forget. Not after that gift, not after that look, and not after the way he made me agree to see him again with nothing more than a voice, gentle as air. The sleek black car stopped in front of my apartment exactly at 6 o'clock, just as promised. The driver, dressed in a formal suit, stepped out, bowed politely, and opened the rear door. I had planned to protest, to refuse being picked up like some heroine in a romantic novel, but instead, I quietly stepped inside, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wasn't even sure what I was looking for tonight. We drove in silence for more than 10 minutes before stopping in front of a small Italian restaurant tucked between quiet streets in the northern part of the city, the kind only locals who truly knew good food would recognize. No flashy signs, no neon lights, just the warm glow of amber lamps spilling through glass windows and the low hum of jazz drifting softly from within. Matthew was already there, standing beneath the awning, wearing a long gray overcoat with the collar turned up, half hiding the sharp line of his jaw. When he saw me, his gaze lingered for a few seconds, not too long, not too brief, but long enough for me to feel a deliberate kind of attention. He stepped forward, extending his hand with effortless grace, as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. I shook it. His skin was cool at first, then quickly warmed against mine. We were led to a secluded corner table where the lighting was softer and the music low enough that we didn't need to whisper, yet loud enough to fill the spaces between words. When we sat down, he set the menu aside without looking at it. I guessed he came here often. I ordered a simple pasta, and he chose red wine and the day's special grilled fish. We began with the easy subjects: food, the weather in Seattle, the way I'd fallen in love with cats at 10 years old after rescuing a kitten from the rain. He didn't laugh aloud, but his eyes brightened as I spoke. When the waiter left, his expression shifted, calmer, more intent. "Do you often push yourself until you collapse?" His voice carried no reproach, only a steady concern that was impossible to deflect. I shrugged. Hospitals are always short-staffed, and I'm not good at saying no. It's a common flaw among people who choose to heal others, I suppose. He nodded slightly, as though he'd known the answer before asking. Then he set down his wineglass, leaned forward on his elbow, and his eyes didn't leave mine. "I know you've been trying to figure out who I am, and I don't intend to play the mysterious stranger for long, but there are things that, if revealed too soon, make people see only the surface and forget what lies beneath." I said nothing, not out of fear, but because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer yet. He didn't continue, only watched me, as if waiting for me to choose how to respond. Instead of asking, I smiled faintly. "I think you're someone who knows exactly what you're doing, who arranges everything according to plan, but also someone who stops to help a woman collapse in the rain. I don't know how many people live with both sides like that, but I know I've met one of them." For the first time that evening, Matthew smiled. It wasn't forced or cautious, just real, fleeting as lightning, yet enough for me to notice the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, traces of time that couldn't be hidden. Dinner ended in a quiet ease, not awkward, not unfinished. He drove me home in the same car, and when we stood at my door, he didn't ask for anything, didn't stretch the conversation. He only said simply, "Thank you for saying yes." I looked at him for a few seconds before unlocking the door, leaving behind a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not love, not desire, but a quiet pull, undeniable, as though I had stepped a little way into someone else's world, and even without seeing it clearly, I no longer wanted to turn back. The next morning I woke, still caught in the faint echo of the night before Matthew's eyes, that brief smile, the comfortable silences that hadn't felt strange. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had an evening that didn't revolve around work, and yet that realization unsettled me. There was something about him that didn't fit into anything I recognized as normal. No one could be that calm, that courteous, and at the same time anticipate my reactions with such precision, as if he'd known me for years. I was no longer the dreamy woman in her 20s who trusted her instincts blindly. I had seen too much in the hospital, too many eyes that could lie so convincingly they looked honest, and I knew that if any part of me felt doubt, I needed to understand why before things went too far. I opened my laptop while the sky was still gray. Using his full name, I began to search. The first result was a short article from 2 years ago on a local news site about a warehouse fire near Elliott Bay. No one was injured, but the damage was extensive. Police suspected ties to an underground smuggling network along the West Coast. The name Matthew Callahan appeared as a local businessman connected to the burned property, though no charges were filed. I dug deeper. An older article, about 5 years back, reported the death of a man named Vincent Callahan, described as the patriarch of a family organization influential in import and distribution throughout the Pacific Northwest. The death had been ruled an accident, but the comments beneath the article hinted otherwise, whispers of an internal purge masked as tragedy. In the list of heirs, Matthew Callahan's name stood first, accompanied by the phrase, "the only one capable of taking over." I sat motionless for a long while, not because I believed every word, but because the pieces were beginning to fit. A wealthy man who lived in secrecy, a heavily guarded home, every detail reflecting control, medical knowledge precise enough to act in a crisis, a costly gift given without explanation, a dinner invitation that had felt impossible to refuse. And now, threads connecting him to a world I had never stepped into. I searched business records. His name surfaced again, chief executive of a maritime transport company handling international shipments, headquartered in 3 major cities. Nothing explicitly incriminating, yet every trail led to the same conclusion. Matthew wasn't simply a kind stranger who had saved me from the rain. He wasn't just a composed man with a mysterious smile and a voice that lingered in the air. He was someone people hesitated to mention by name, a figure belonging to a world where laws were written in loyalty and sealed with handshakes behind closed doors. I sat before the glowing screen, the silence heavy. There was no solid proof, no official crime, only too many implications, too many signs to pretend I hadn't seen them. What unsettled me most was not fear but a strange restlessness, a curiosity laced with confusion. What was I supposed to do with what I now knew? Confront him? Withdraw before it went any further? Yet a part of me, the part that still warmed when I thought of how he'd looked at me last night, refused to retreat. For some reason I couldn't explain. I believed that if Matthew were truly dangerous, he wouldn't have saved me. And if I were the only one he had chosen to invite into that guarded world of his, then perhaps, in some inexplicable way, that meant something. I spent the entire afternoon trying to work as if nothing had changed, as if the previous night had never happened, as if I hadn't just read a series of articles that could completely alter the way I saw the man named Matthew Callahan. But the truth was, I couldn't concentrate. Every surgery, every case file, every emergency call became a temporary shell, hiding the storm that churned quietly inside me. By the end of the day, when the clinic had emptied and the hallway lights had begun to dim, I stood before the mirror in the staff room, looking at my own reflection, wondering if I was about to make a terrible mistake. I didn't know why I texted him, but I did. A short message. I need to talk. Not at a restaurant. No one else. Less than 10 minutes later, his reply came. You can come here, or I can come to you. Your choice. I sent him my address and waited in silence. He arrived on time, as always, said nothing as he stepped inside, simply removed his coat, and stood across from me in my small kitchen bathed in soft yellow light. No wine, no flowers, none of the polished courtesy that usually softened our meetings, only the quiet hum of what was about to happen. I handed him a glass of water, my hand trembling slightly, not out of fear, but because I knew that after tonight, nothing would be the same. I looked you up, I said plainly. Matthew didn't flinch, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't even look disappointed. He just sat down, his eyes fixed on me. And what did you find? Not enough to condemn you, I answered, but enough to know you're not as simple as you appear. Enough for me to realize I'm stepping into something I don't truly understand. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't hide because I wanted to deceive you, he said, his voice low and calm in a way that unsettled me more than anger could. I hid because I knew if you found out earlier, you'd never have agreed to dinner. You'd never have let me close. And he paused, drawing a deep breath. I didn't want to lose that chance. The chance to see you, to know you, and to believe that maybe someone like me could still deserve something good. My chest tightened, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them. There were no excuses, no rehearsed lines, only truth stripped bare. What do you do, Matthew? I asked quietly. What is it really? He looked at me for a long time, so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, each word deliberate, measured. I run a network most people would call dangerous. But it didn't start that way. My father left it behind when he died, and I had no choice, either step in or let it collapse, taking hundreds of people who depended on it down with it. I chose to hold it together. But I do it my way. No trafficking, no drugs, no meaningless violence. Just a system that, from the outside, looks terrifying, but inside, I've tried to keep it as clean as I can. I didn't know what to say. Somehow, impossibly, I believed him. Yet at the same time, I knew I was standing on a razor's edge between right and wrong, morality and emotion. Why me? I whispered. Why did you choose me to bring into your life? Matthew stood, stepping closer, not touching me but close enough that I could see his eyes steady and unguarded. Because you're not like anyone I've ever known. Because you don't need me to be someone else to see that I might still be worth something. I turned away, overwhelmed. I knew I was being pulled into a world I didn't belong to, drawn to a man whose life I could never control. And yet, I also knew that if I stepped back now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. And that thought frightened me even more. We didn't kiss that night. There were no reckless gestures, No impulsive moves to ease the tension simmering between us. Matthew left after a long, quiet moment in the small kitchen, where the dim light shimmered off the untouched cup of tea he'd left behind. I didn't stop him, and he didn't ask to stay, but that didn't mean nothing had changed. In the days that followed, we texted often short exchanges that maintained a fragile thread between us, as though we both knew that letting go even once would return us to the safe distance we'd barely crossed. I wondered if I was losing my bearings when, every time his name lit up my screen, my heart skipped a beat. Not because I didn't understand the risk, but because I understood it too well. Some nights I woke from dreams where his voice echoed inside me longer than I dared admit. A week after that conversation, Matthew invited me to dinner at his house, not at a restaurant, not in a space where manners built walls, but in his kitchen, where the fireplace glowed each time the air turned cold. He cooked, simple and precise, like everything else in his life. Pasta, red wine, and a faint old jazz melody playing in the background. There were no heavy questions, no confessions. Just two people sitting across from each other, sharing a moment as if neither wanted to break the delicate silence that held it together. After dinner, we stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the lake. The wind brushed softly against us, cool enough that I pulled my coat tighter. Matthew reached out his hand, slowly, gently, without demand, a quiet invitation. I placed mine in his, feeling its warmth fully for the first time, without barriers. When I turned to him, his eyes were no longer cold. They had softened, deep and unguarded, so sincere that I wanted to move closer even as every rational thought in me screamed not to. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't hurried or hungry, just a hesitant kiss, the kind that feels like stepping into uncharted land. And after that, neither of us stepped back. That night, I stayed, not because of promises, not because of any plan for what came next, but simply because I didn't want to leave him. The bedroom was dim, the air warm, every movement unhurried, as if we were both trying to memorize the rhythm of each breath, each touch, each quiet meeting of eyes. He didn't tell me he loved me, and I didn't need to say it. Some truths don't need words, they live in the way he held me through the night, as if letting go would make me disappear. The next morning, he woke before I did, brewed coffee, and placed a cup by the bed. I sat up, my hair tousled, my eyes still heavy from lack of sleep, and he looked at me as though I was something he had waited a very long time to touch. He didn't ask what I would do next. He just sat there, quiet as always, waiting for me to decide. And I, still uncertain, still unprepared for a life where love arrives without warning, stayed. I took a sip of the hot coffee and let my heart accept the truth I could no longer undo. We had fallen in love when neither of us was ready, when too much remained unknown. Yet in that moment, I knew that if anything was worth risking the familiar safety of my life, it was the man sitting before me in that silent room, where every sound seemed small beside the beating of my own heart. At first, I thought I was just too exhausted. The long shifts, the restless sleep, the tangled emotions, they all seemed enough to explain the way my body was reacting. I felt more drained than usual, slightly nauseous in the mornings, my mind slow, with moments when I barely remembered what I had done in the past hour. I blamed everything but the most obvious reason. But when I began to count the days, then count them again, my heart started to tighten with every beat. On my way home from a late shift, I stopped by a pharmacy, unable to meet the cashier's eyes, clutching the paper bag as if loosening my grip would make everything shatter. I waited until night had covered the city, until every sound outside had faded, before I dared to hold the pregnancy test in my hand. 2 lines, clear, undeniable. I stared at the result for a long time, as if time itself had frozen. A part of me wanted to cry, not from fear, but from not knowing whether this was a gift or a challenge meant for someone like me, someone still struggling to believe in a steady future. I didn't tell Matthew right away. 1 day passed, then 2, then a week. Every time I looked at him, my chest ached with a confusion I couldn't name. He was still gentle, still caring in that quiet, deliberate way that was entirely his. A cup of tea brewed just the way I liked, a soft reminder to check my blood sugar, a reassuring squeeze of my hand when he sensed I was troubled but hadn't said a word. I told myself I needed time to be certain, to understand what this meant for both of us. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing existed between us. Afraid that when I told him, he'd see me differently or worse, that he'd try to change himself because of it. And I didn't want that. I wanted him to remain Matthew, my Matthew, even as the world around us shifted. One morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sunlight slipped through the curtains, bathing the room in a tender glow. He was still asleep, his breathing steady, one arm draped over me like an unspoken promise. I watched him for a long while, then placed a hand over my stomach where life had begun to stir. Tiny, fragile, yet powerful enough to shake the very ground beneath me. I knew I couldn't hide it forever, and I knew that if anyone could face this truth with me, it was the man lying beside me. That evening, after a simple dinner in the kitchen, as we lingered at the table, I placed my hand down, fingers trembling slightly, and whispered, almost inaudibly, "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at me, his expression shifting immediately not to worry, but to full attention. My throat tightened, my heartbeat thundered in my ears. "I'm pregnant." The air seemed to still. He didn't react right away. No words came for several long seconds that felt like an eternity. Then he reached across the table, his movement slow but certain. "How long?" "Almost 2 weeks," I whispered. "I'm not sure yet." Matthew didn't let me finish. He stood, came to me, and knelt, placing his hands gently over my stomach, his eyes softening so suddenly that tears welled in mine. He didn't ask if the child was his. He didn't ask why I'd kept it secret. He simply said one thing, his voice low and warm, like a promise drawn straight from his heart. "We'll do this together. No matter what happens, you're not alone." After that night, something between us changed in a way I couldn't define. It wasn't that he became different, or that I felt lost. It was quieter than that, a calmness spreading through every corner of our lives, as though a door had opened. And though neither of us was ready to step through, we both knew there was no turning back. Matthew didn't talk much about the future, but his every action carried certainty. He began calling me between shifts, just to ask how I felt, sending meals at the right times when he knew I was tired, taking me to prenatal checkups before I even asked. He didn't do it to perform, nor out of duty, but with a quiet steadiness like a great tree sheltering the small, growing life within me. And yet, that steadiness frightened me too. I began to wonder if I was slipping deeper into something uncertain, where love and sacrifice blurred into one. Some nights I woke and watched him sleeping beside me, asking myself what I would do if one day he were gone, how I would raise this child, guard this heart, continue this life I was beginning to place in his hands. Then one rainy day, when the city was drenched in gray, Matthew drove me north of Seattle, a few hours away, to a wooden cabin hidden deep in the forest beside a small murmuring stream. He said he wanted me to rest, to get away from the noise and the strain. The cabin was modest but warm, with a crackling fire, old wooden walls that smelled of pine, and 2 steaming cups of tea waiting on the table. I didn't think much of it until he asked me to come outside. The rain had eased to a fine mist. We walked along a leaf-covered path, his hand holding mine as if afraid I might slip. Under an old oak tree, he stopped. Before us stood a small wooden table, placed as though it had always belonged to the forest. On it was a deep blue box, its elegant design familiar from magazines I'd once leafed through. My heart began to race. Matthew turned to me, his gaze free of its usual restraint. He didn't kneel, didn't recite any grand words. He simply opened the box, revealing a simple yet beautiful platinum ring. His voice carried through the wind, low and certain, blending with the scent of damp earth. "Claire," he said, "you walked into my life as something I never saw coming. I don't know if I can be the perfect husband. I don't know if I can protect you and our child from everything behind me. But I know this: if you'll accept me, if you'll accept this life, I will give everything I have to make sure you never feel alone again. Please, let me call you my wife." My tears fell before I could stop them. There was so much I didn't know, so many doubts left unnamed, but nothing had ever felt more real. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him for a long moment, then nodded softly, but enough to make the wind seem to still around us. Matthew slid the ring onto my trembling hand, his grip gentle yet sure. Neither of us said another word. We simply stood there, in the forest, beneath the ancient oak, where love wasn't loud or rushed, but grew quietly in the silence, like 2 lost souls who had finally found each other in a world that was never meant for them. I never imagined that meeting the family of the man I loved would make my heart race this fast, not because I feared rejection or intrusive questions, but because I was about to step into the deepest, most private part of Matthew's world, a place no one outside his family had ever entered. Nona's house was about a 30-minute drive south of Seattle, nestled in a quiet neighborhood lined with crimson maple trees that marked autumn at its loveliest. It was a 3-story brick home built in the old Italian style, with curved black iron balconies and hanging pots of petunias spilling gently over the railings. Before I could even step out of the car, I saw her waiting on the porch, her eyes bright, her posture straight, the kind of woman whose presence carried both experience and quiet strength. She was the first person who ever made me feel I should have prepared more carefully than I would for an operating room. Nona, Matthew's grandmother, was the only surviving member of the family from the chaotic era that had shaped the world he grew up in. She held no title, no official power, yet she was the family's anchor, the keeper of traditions, and of the unspoken rules everyone respected. Matthew held my hand as we climbed the steps. She said nothing at first, just studied me closely, as if reading each line of thought behind my eyes, and then finally smiled. "Come in, dear. It's cold out here." Her voice was raspy but warm, slow and comforting like the soft crackle of old wood in a fire. Inside, the house smelled of simmering tomatoes, fresh basil, and bread just pulled from the oven. On the hand-embroidered tablecloth lay dishes I'd only ever seen in cookbooks: crispy baked lasagna, beef braised in red wine, rocket salad with thin Parmesan shavings, and steaming loaves of golden bread. Nona invited me to sit beside her, with Matthew across the table. The dinner felt strangely balanced between comfort and quiet caution. She didn't ask many questions, but each one carried weight. She asked where I worked, whether I loved my job, and when I spoke about the clinic and the long night shifts, she nodded as if understanding parts of me words couldn't explain. When I mentioned that I was pregnant, she placed her hand gently over mine and squeezed. "Do you know that being a mother is both the most beautiful and the hardest thing in the world?" she said, not as advice, but as a truth passed down from one generation of women to another, from those who understood that love wasn't only made of promises, but of endurance. After dinner, while Matthew stepped outside to take a call, she led me to the living room, where a large family portrait hung on the wall. The picture was old, its colors faded to sepia, but the man's eyes, Matthew's father, remained sharp and cold, much like the way Matthew looked at people he didn't trust. "Matthew isn't like his father," she said quietly. "He chose his own path, not entirely clean, but clean enough to keep the people he loves safe. And if you're the one who makes him believe he deserves a normal life, don't leave him. Not because he needs saving, but because he's gone too far to find his way back alone." I turned to her, seeing in her deep eyes a lifetime of loss that words could never capture. I nodded this time without hesitation. On the drive home, Matthew didn't ask what Nona and I had talked about. He simply took my hand and held it tightly, and I knew that, though the road ahead would be uncertain, this moment with his hand in mine and the quiet acceptance of the woman who mattered most in his life was a beginning I no longer feared. Everything after that evening at Nona's seemed to move to a new rhythm, steadier but not entirely peaceful. I returned to work at the clinic, trying to live by a gentle routine, examining patients, monitoring my pregnancy, coming home with Matthew on rainy nights, waking beside him in the mornings when he had already gone without a sound. His presence in my life became like breath, constant, unspoken, and I had grown used to it, used to the silences, to the looks that needed no words, used to loving in a way that didn't fit any ordinary mold. But the calm began to crack. At first, it was the late-night phone calls Matthew took behind the closed door of his study. Then, unannounced disappearances followed, and when he returned, his eyes were darker, his silences heavier. I didn't ask, not because I didn't want to know, but because I understood he was trying to keep me on the safe side of a door he didn't want me to cross. Then one afternoon, as I was closing up the clinic, a stranger came looking for me. He wore a dark suit, his face expressionless, his voice so cold it made me shiver. "You're Claire, right?" I nodded. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside were photographs of Matthew meeting with a group of men in an empty parking lot, apparently exchanging something. A small piece of paper was tucked among them, bearing only one line. "Do you think he's told you everything?" My hands clenched, my pulse quickened. I didn't know who they were, but I knew this wasn't a random warning. When I got home, Matthew was already there. I placed the envelope on the table before him without a word. He opened it, glanced through the pictures, then looked up, his face betraying no surprise. He exhaled, sat down, and said, "They're from the north, Culver Street. Used to be allies. Not anymore. They want to reclaim certain shipping routes. When I refused, they started using old methods to apply pressure. My throat went dry. What about me? About the baby? Are we safe? Matthew watched me for a long moment, then stepped closer, his hand resting on my shoulder, warm, heavy, steady. He didn't promise absolute safety, but he promised to do everything in his power to protect us. I believed him, yet an unease lingered inside me like a dark cloud hovering near the horizon. I started noticing strangers around the neighborhood, cars that lingered too long by the curb, faces that turned away too quickly. One morning, when I went to my car, a photograph was taped to the windshield of me leaving the clinic, with a scrawled message beneath. "Are you sure you chose the right man?" I showed it to Matthew that night, and for the first time, I saw him truly angry, not at me, but at himself. He made a call, his voice low and hard, issuing orders I couldn't decipher, and he didn't sleep at all that night. I lay beside him, one hand over my stomach, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, realizing that I was living in a world where every choice carried risk. But I didn't leave. I didn't pack a bag, didn't run, didn't demand explanations, because deep down, I knew I had already chosen to stay long before I fully understood what that choice meant. I had chosen Matthew, chosen this love, chosen the life growing inside me, and if his world was truly made of darkness, then I would be the small light within it if that was what it took to help him find his way out. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound of faint click somewhere downstairs, small but sharp enough to pull me fully awake. Matthew wasn't beside me. That was unusual. He always checked every lock before bed, always returned to my side before I stirred. I slipped on my robe and descended the staircase slowly, each step whispering against the cold wood. A sliver of light spilled through the crack of the half-open living room door. I reached for the handle just as Matthew's voice came low and urgent, a tone that wasn't meant for me. I froze, my heart pounding, catching fragments of a conversation about a suspicious car parked outside for 3 nights in a row, about the security system being disabled for 15 minutes without leaving a trace, and a photograph sent directly to Matthew's office with a chilling message. "She won't make it out alive unless you cooperate." I stepped in just as the last words fell, and Matthew turned instantly. His eyes shifted in that brief moment, as though he wanted to shield me from everything and then realized there was nothing left to hide. He gestured for the man to leave, then came closer and took my hand gently, silently. I didn't need an explanation. I understood. The threat was no longer implied, it was real, tangible, something you could almost touch. And for the first time since I'd met Matthew, I saw true fear in his eyes, not for himself, for me, for our child. The next morning, he told me to pack only the essentials. He didn't say where we were going, only warned me not to call anyone, not to text, not to leave a trace. I nodded, said nothing, my hands trembling as I folded what little I needed. He drove me to a wooden cabin deep in the mountains beyond the city, where phone signals came and went, and the paths leading in were nothing but narrow trails. The cabin was surrounded by tall pines, and a small lake behind it that mirrored the morning light like glass. In another life, it could have been a retreat. Now, it was a refuge. Matthew didn't stay. He kissed my forehead before leaving longer than usual, as if every second was a way to memorize me. "You're safe here," he said softly. "2 men are stationed outside. Everything you need is already set. I'll come back as soon as it's done." I held his hand one last time before he turned away. "Don't let yourself get hurt." He didn't promise, but his silent nod was enough for me to believe. The days that followed passed slowly, as if time itself were testing my patience. I spent hours reading, walking around the lake, writing in my journal, and resting my hand on my belly each morning, whispering promises I had never spoken to anyone before. Sometimes I stood by the window, staring into the quiet woods, imagining what might be happening hundreds of miles away. I didn't know what Matthew was doing, whom he was fighting, or what he was sacrificing, but I knew he was doing it for us. One afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains and darkness poured down like a flood, I heard footsteps, familiar ones. Not hurried, not heavy. I opened the door before he could knock. Matthew stood there, his face leaner, a faint scratch along his cheekbone, but his eyes, the eyes I loved, were steady, deep, alive. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him, feeling his heartbeat and knowing that every storm would eventually pass as long as we kept holding on to each other. And in that moment, in that quiet cabin buried in the woods, I understood that his world might always be shadowed, But within that darkness, he had carved out a small space of light just for me and the child, growing inside me a place where love didn't have to be safe to survive, only deep enough to endure. Matthew never told me the details of what had happened while I was in hiding, but I saw the change in him clearly. His eyes no longer carried the calm of a man who protected with gentle words, but the gravity of one who had walked through darkness and returned with wounds not yet healed. He became quieter, more deliberate. The late-night calls were gone, the hurried messages too. In their place were silent mornings where he'd sit by the window with a cooling cup of coffee, staring at the distant trees, though I knew he wasn't really seeing them, only the thoughts still moving behind his gaze. I began to glimpse another layer of this man, one he had always hidden from me, the warrior who fought quietly, without leaving traces, without seeking praise or recognition. He handled things his way, and that alone was enough to make his enemies lose long before they realized they'd been defeated. I knew he'd met with former allies to deliver final warnings. I knew he'd rebuilt the entire security structure, rerouted transportation lines, and severed weak links within the organization. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew that Matthew's control had tightened. He didn't need to fire a gun. His presence alone was enough to make others retreat. One night, I woke again and found his side of the bed empty. I followed the faint glow spilling from his office and stopped at the door, watching him. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, a fresh scrape along his arm, the phone beside him, and a map spread wide across the desk. He didn't notice me. His eyes were fixed on the markings, the zones I couldn't name. Something in that sight made my chest ache, not from fear, but from tenderness. He was carrying the weight of the world just to keep me and our child safe. The next day, I quietly opened one of the folders in the safe. I knew it wasn't right, but I needed to understand. Inside were lists of those who had betrayed him, records of severed ties, documents about financial systems he was working to legitimize, turning his empire into something cleaner, stepping out, little by little, from the gray world he had been born into. He wasn't just fighting his enemies, he was fighting his own past. That night, I held him longer than usual, said nothing, just placed my hand on his back and my cheek against his shoulder. He pulled me closer, gently, but I could feel the exhaustion in his arms. "You know everything now, don't you?" he murmured. I nodded silently. He sighed. "I thought I could shield you from this side of me, but now I see you're the reason I can face it at all." I didn't tell him everything would be fine. I didn't promise that our life would ever be spotless. But I knew this. In all that uncertainty, I chose to stay. Not because I needed a strong man to protect me, but because I believed in the man who was trying to step out of the shadows to bring us into the light. And if he had to fight in silence, then I would be the one standing quietly behind him, not to change him, but to be the reason he never gave up. The first pain came on a gray April morning when Seattle was wrapped in a fine, silken drizzle. At first, I thought it was the usual heaviness of the final month of pregnancy, but when the second wave hit sharp, deep, and strong enough to make me clutch the edge of the bed just to stay upright, I knew something was wrong. I called Matthew, my voice breaking between ragged breaths. He only needed to hear one sentence, "I think something's wrong," and within 20 minutes, he was there. As the car sped through rain-slick streets, I lay on my side in the back seat, cold sweat breaking across my skin, my hand gripping Matthew's hand stretched back from the front seat, holding on as if he could anchor me to this world. In his eyes was fear, raw, unmistakable fear, the kind I had never seen even when he spoke of rival factions, threats, or the possibility of bloodshed. The hospital greeted us in a blur of white light and the urgent squeal of gurney wheels on tile, nurses calling to one another in clipped tones. My blood pressure had dropped, the baby's heartbeat was irregular, and after a single glance at the ultrasound screen, the doctor ordered an emergency C-section. Everything afterward dissolved into haze. I remember the harsh brightness of the operating lamp, the frantic rhythm of my baby's heartbeat on the monitor, Matthew's voice whispering close to my ear. "Don't be afraid, you'll be fine." I remember wanting to tell him, "If it's a girl, name her Evelyn," but no words came, only silence as the anesthesiologist began the countdown. My eyes met his one last time before everything sank into darkness. I woke in a dim room surrounded by tubes and monitors, the sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint plastic smell of IV lines. Matthew was there, sitting by my bedside, his hand still wrapped around mine as if it had never left. His eyes were red, and for the first time, I saw him cry, not loudly, not brokenly, but silently, tears falling without a sound as he tightened his grip. "Evelyn's safe," he said softly. She's a girl, 6 pounds, a bit weak, but breathing on her own. She looks just like you." I couldn't speak. Tears filled my eyes too, not from pain but from the miracle of life, fragile and small, arriving after all we had endured. The next day, they moved me to recovery, and for the first time, I saw her a pink-skinned baby with closed eyes, a head of dark hair, and tiny fingers that wrapped around mine when the nurse laid her on my chest for skin-to-skin contact. I cried uncontrollably. Every fear, every tension, every question I'd ever asked myself whether I was worthy of motherhood, whether this world had room for a child born from both shadow and light dissolved, as I felt her heartbeat sinking with mine. Matthew stood beside us, his gaze fixed on the two of us. When I looked up, he leaned close and whispered, his voice rough from sleepless hours, "Evelyn saved me too. That little girl is the reason I'll hold on to whatever good is left in me." I smiled through tears, my hand finding his, and for the first time in months, my heart beat calmly. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside the room, there was light. Evelyn was our bridge, a new beginning. No longer fighting merely to protect, but to build something that could last, a family. And in that first moment together, the three of us, I knew that every scar, every fear, every imperfection could be healed, beginning from the smallest place, the heart of a newborn child. Evelyn was taken to the neonatal intensive care unit soon after surgery. Her lungs were weak and needed support. I couldn't go with her, but Matthew could. As the nurse wheeled her out, he held my hand and released it so slowly, as though even a moment's distance might undo him. But I knew she needed him more than me. There was something in his eyes, focus, stillness, that told me this was the first time in his life he had surrendered to a feeling beyond control. He said nothing when he entered the NICU. He simply washed his hands, put on the sterile gown, and approached the incubator where our daughter lay so tiny amid wires, tubes, and the steady hum of machines. She was so small that when he slipped a finger into her palm, her whole hand barely covered the tip, but she gripped it immediately, as if she already knew this was the safest place in the world. The nurses told me he stayed there for hours, motionless. No phone, no distractions, no words, just watching her. He talked to her in that gravelly, low voice, telling her that her mother was brave, that we had waited so long for her, that if the world ever felt too big, she only needed to hold her father's hand. One senior nurse, who'd worked in NICU for nearly 20 years, told me she had never seen a father look so much like he was praying without ever bowing his head. Matthew was never one for tender words, but before his tiny daughter, every trace of his guarded self disappeared. He photographed her every movement, sending me pictures each morning. Once, he texted, "Evelyn kicked her right leg today, seems she likes to kick hard. You sure she didn't get that from you?" I laughed despite the soreness that still ached through my body. Those little messages softened the exhaustion, quieted the lingering fear that crept in whenever I looked at the empty bed beside me. After 3 days, I was strong enough to visit NICU in a wheelchair. When the door opened and I saw him sitting there with her pressed against his bare chest, practicing kangaroo care, tears blurred my vision. The soft light fell across his shoulders, and in the look he gave me, I saw it plain and certain Matthew was no longer the man I met that first rainy night. He was a father now, a real one, not because he knew everything, but because he allowed himself to be vulnerable before this tiny life, letting her touch the gentlest part of his heart, the part the world thought he didn't have. We sat together by the incubator all that afternoon, in silence, listening to the machines, the heartbeats, the delicate sounds of life beginning. For the first time, we didn't speak of danger, or the past, or tomorrow. There was only this moment, a living heartbeat, love in its purest, most instinctive form, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, as long as Matthew stayed here, his hand on our daughter's back, whispering to her in that low, loving voice, Evelyn would always know she was born from a love that was never easy, but utterly, undeniably real. That morning, the sun was soft, one of those rare, tender rays that break through after days of endless Seattle rain, as if the whole universe were quietly exhaling, ready for something good to happen. Evelyn had been home for a week, sleeping peacefully in the little crib beside our bed, and I stood before the mirror in a simple white dress, my hands trembling slightly as I fastened the silver hairpin Nona had given me. It was an heirloom, a small lavender-engraved pin she had worn on her own wedding day more than 60 years ago. There was no grand chapel, no choir, no bells ringing through the air like the fairy tale weddings I'd once dreamed of as a girl. But there was Nona's back garden, the arch of white flowers that Matthew had built himself with 2 childhood friends, and Nona's warm hand holding mine before I stepped toward the man waiting at the end of the aisle. Matthew wore a charcoal gray suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, his hair combed neatly, yet still carrying that familiar touch of defiance. But his eyes, when they found me, held nothing of the guarded man I once met. In them was everything: gratitude, love, a promise, and a kind of wonder that after all we had endured, such peace could truly exist. The ceremony was small, intimate, surrounded only by a handful of people we trusted. Dr. Sarah from the clinic was there too, serving as witness, and perhaps the most emotional one of all, as I read my vows. I spoke of the journey that had led me to Matthew, of that first stormy night, of the moments I nearly walked away out of fear, and finally of the instant when Evelyn's tiny hand gripped mine inside the incubator, and I knew I had chosen right. Matthew didn't read from paper. He held my hands, looked straight into me, and said in his deep, husky voice that I had saved him from himself, that Evelyn was the most beautiful thing we had ever created, but that I was the first person who ever made him believe he could have a real life. He said that if everything collapsed tomorrow, he would never regret having called me his wife today. When the ring slid onto my finger, it felt as though a door opened behind me, leaving every old wound and piece of sorrow on the other side. We kissed amid gentle applause, flower petals falling from the arch, Nona's laughter soft and tearful, and Evelyn's tiny cry from Dr. Sarah's arms breaking the air like the sweetest song. The small reception followed right there in the garden. There was no fine wine, no extravagant menu, only pasta made by Nona's own hands, fresh bread, cold cuts, and simple salad that tasted like home. People talked and laughed, and I carried Evelyn in my arms, walking her between the wooden tables so she could feel the air of a day that marked the beginning of our new life together. As the afternoon turned golden, Matthew led me to a quiet corner of the garden where an old wooden swing hung the one he had repaired just a week before. He let me sit first, then sat beside me, his arm draped around my back, his head resting lightly against my shoulder. The moment needed no words. There was only the wind weaving through the leaves and the steady rhythm of our daughter's breathing in my arms. I leaned into him, thinking of everything we had survived, every loss, every night I thought we wouldn't make it, and for the first time, I felt utterly certain that I belonged to this man, to this life, to the home we were building out of love, forgiveness, and the scars we no longer needed to hide. That small wedding wasn't an ending, it was a declaration that I, Claire, was now truly part of Matthew, of Evelyn, of a family I had never dared to believe I deserved. But that day, beneath the gentle sun and the faint scent of lavender, I knew I was no longer a passerby in someone else's story. I was home. 3 weeks after the wedding, our life entered an entirely new rhythm, no longer evenings beneath flower arches or quiet mornings over coffee. Now, every hour revolved around feedings, diaper changes, lullabies, burping, pumping milk, and washing bottles. Evelyn wasn't a fussy baby, but she woke many times each night, crying from hunger, then sleeping deeply through the day, turning my body clock inside out until I could no longer tell morning from night. There were nights I paced the living room for an hour, rocking her gently, singing the lullabies my mother once sang to me, my voice hoarse and my eyes stinging with exhaustion. Sometimes I stood before the mirror at 3 a.m, hair tangled, nightgown soaked with milk, dark circles like smudges of ash beneath my eyes, and laughed softly at the tired woman staring back. I had once saved dying animals, once worked 36-hour shifts at the clinic, but I had never known fatigue like this. Matthew did everything he could. He learned to mix formula, to swaddle, to tell the difference between the cry of hunger and the cry of discomfort. He held Evelyn as though she were a fragile treasure, so gently that it made me want to cry each time I watched him. But even for him, it wasn't easy. There were nights I'd find him sitting motionless by the crib, eyes closed for only a moment, before snapping open again, as if afraid he might miss something. Sometimes he'd rest a hand on my back in the kitchen, while I washed yet another bottle, and whisper, "I never knew raising a child could be this hard." And yet, in those sleepless nights, through our baby's cries and the scent of milk on every piece of clothing, our love grew quietly, patiently, no longer made of sweet words, but of small acts. "Did you eat yet? I'll watch her so you can shower. You okay?" Love became the unspoken rhythm of who got up first to make a bottle, who remembered to buy diapers, who stayed awake so the other could sleep a little longer. One morning, after a rare stretch of sleep, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen table. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known," it said. "I've never seen anyone as beautiful as you are when you hold her in the dark, your voice rough but so full of love. If I could carry half of what you carry, I would, without hesitation. Just know I see it all. And I'm grateful every day." I sat there in silence, reading his words, then pulled our daughter close, feeling the weight of exhaustion lift just a little. Parenthood wasn't easy, but with him, I never felt alone in it. Evelyn grew a little more each day. Her first smile brought both of us to tears. Her first babbling sounds, in the middle of a rainy afternoon, seemed to fill the house with light, and I realized that no matter how many sleepless nights or moments of helplessness, these small, miraculous firsts were worth it all. In Matthew's arms, with Evelyn nestled against my chest, I knew we were learning how to be parents imperfect but devoted, uncertain but steadfast. And that, I thought, was love in its purest, most enduring form. 6 months after Evelyn was born, I returned to the veterinary clinic, where everything had once been the heartbeat of my life before it all changed. Sarah hugged me tightly that first morning back, her eyes filled with empathy and gratitude, as if she understood that my return was not just about work, it was about reclaiming a piece of myself. I still remember the smell of disinfectant, the familiar whimpers of cats and dogs echoing in the hall, the chill of the metal operating table under my fingertips, and the sudden, surprising rush of my own pulse. I had once been the woman who lived for her job, who could stay awake all night to save a dog with a fractured pelvis or monitor a newborn kitten's vitals for 3 straight days without leaving its side. And yet, standing there again, I felt both at home and foreign, as though I carried a new layer of skin, the skin of a mother. Returning wasn't easy. Evelyn still nursed through the night, and every morning I pumped milk so Matthew could bottle feed her. I woke earlier than before, prepared bottles and clothes, then held my daughter close for a long time before walking out the door. Once, she screamed the moment I turned away, and I froze in the doorway with tears filling my eyes. But Matthew stepped in, gently taking her in his arms, whispering, "You need to be yourself too, not just a mother," then closed the door behind me. A quiet promise that he had things covered at home. Work made me feel like the old Claire again, strong, quick, decisive. Yet every time I came home and heard Evelyn's laughter in her father's arms, I realized I was no longer the same woman. I had become fuller, softer, perhaps more fragile, but finally aware of what truly mattered. Matthew worked less now, spending more time at home since I'd returned to the clinic. He learned to cook simple dinners, to warm bottles to the perfect temperature, even took Evelyn for walks every evening in the park nearby. One afternoon I came home early and found him sitting under a tree, a baby carrier strapped to his chest, Evelyn fast asleep inside, while he read a book. The sight nearly brought me to tears. Who would have thought that the man who once led an organization could become such a patient, tender father? We began to find balance, sharing baby duties, house chores, even unspoken weariness. Dinners were sometimes instant noodles, sometimes cold pizza, but always filled with laughter. Some nights we were too exhausted to talk, lying quietly side by side, our hands still intertwined in the dark. Evelyn grew each day, her smile sharper, her first word, "Daddy," instead of "Mommy," which made me both jealous and amused. Yet her little giggles became the force that kept us moving forward. I was no longer the woman who lived only to work. I learned to say no, to rest, to give myself permission to slow down. I understood that balance wasn't doing everything, but loving myself through all the roles I carried. And Matthew changed too. He slowly withdrew from the old life, bringing his business into legitimate order, speaking less of the past and more of the future. One night, he whispered that he had once thought strength meant needing no one, but now he knew true strength was knowing that someone needed him, and that he needed them too. We no longer lived in constant tension or fear, tired, sleepless, uncertain as the future might be. Our life now was a choice, a daily decision, to love each other in the smallest acts, in the rhythm of ordinary days, in the way Evelyn looked at us with those bright, trusting eyes. And I knew with all my heart that we were exactly where we were meant to be. I began to notice a shift in Matthew's eyes a few weeks earlier, when he started leaving home earlier and returning later, even though most of his official responsibilities had already been handed to a trusted team. Each time I asked, he smiled, assuring me it was just unfinished paperwork. But I knew better. Something was stirring beneath the surface, something he wasn't ready to share because he didn't want me to worry. I respected that, yet couldn't shake the cold unease that crept up my spine whenever his phone lit with unnamed messages or late-night calls answered in a low voice before he stepped out of the room. That night, he came home later than usual, rain still clinging to his coat, his face set in a grimness that made me wordless as I poured him a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing for a long while, before finally speaking in a controlled, quiet tone that carried more danger than shouting. Someone from his old circle was back not to seize power, but to destroy from within. They were people he had once trusted, once helped, now turning against him, joining forces with an old rival to shake the foundation he had worked so hard to rebuild cleanly. I reached for his hand, but he didn't look at me. His eyes then weren't the eyes of Matthew, the husband, the father. They were the eyes of the man he used to be, the one who had walked through blood and shadow to claim everything he once held. He told me not to worry, but I knew this time was different. It wasn't an outside threat, it was betrayal from within, and Matthew would not let it go unanswered. Over the next 2 days, he was almost never home, returning only for a few hours' sleep beside Evelyn before leaving again. One by one, the old names vanished, removed quietly, efficiently, without a trace. Links went dark, accounts frozen, access cut off as if an invisible hand was methodically tightening around the brittle bones of a beast that had been dormant too long. One rare afternoon when he was home, I found him standing at the window, watching Evelyn sleeping in her stroller outside. I came up behind him, placed a hand on his back, and for the first time asked directly, "Do I need to know what's happening?" He turned to me, his eyes tired but steady. "You don't need the details," he said. "Just know that I'll never let it touch you or her. I'd rather become the man I once had to leave behind than let my family be hurt. I still have limits, but this time, I won't hold back." They crossed the only sacred line I have left. A week later, I read the news: several major companies abruptly changing ownership, powerful figures under financial investigation, a West Coast network quietly dismantled. No one mentioned Matthew, but I knew his hand was behind it all. Silent, precise, merciless. That was how he fought, cold, efficient, leaving no room for mistakes. I didn't ask further, but each time he came home, I looked at him longer, tracing the small new scrape on his hand, whispering, "We're still here. We're waiting for you, no matter what you have to do." Because I knew beneath the calm and the steel his heart had learned to love gently, and that love would keep him from crossing too far into the dark. In the silence of those unseen wars, I was his place to return to, and Evelyn was his reason to keep fighting. And even if he had to put on that old armor once more, this time, he wasn't fighting alone. I never thought there would come a day when I would sit beside my husband in a closed-door meeting, surrounded by men in tailored suits whose eyes were sharp and guarded, whose every movement felt calculated, as if even breathing were part of a high-stakes gamble. And yet, there I was in a discreet back room of a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town, where the warm golden light could not soften the heavy air that hung over the table. Matthew sat at the head, sleeves rolled up on his charcoal shirt, no tie, no weapon, yet carrying a weight that silenced the room the moment he spoke. I sat to his right, quiet, but far from invisible. My presence there was a statement. That I was not merely his wife, not just the mother of his child, but the woman who had chosen, with full awareness, to walk into his world, to see both its light and its shadows and not turn away. A few days earlier, when Matthew told me that things were coming to an end, that he might have to handle the final reckoning himself to close what was left of the betrayal, I had looked at him for a long time. I saw the conflict in his eyes, not doubt in his ability, but fear that I would no longer accept that version of him if I saw it again. But this time, I didn't ask what he intended to do. I simply stepped closer, took his hand, and said, "I'm coming with you." He froze, took a step back, as if he hadn't heard me right, but I said it again, slower, clearer, leaving no room for refusal. "I don't need to be protected anymore, Matthew. I need to be trusted. I need to know where I stand in your life, and if you're still the man I chose, then I won't stand behind you, I'll walk beside you." From that moment, everything changed. He stopped hiding things from me. He told me about the moves being made, the people involved, the dangers waiting. He asked my opinion on certain decisions, not to seek permission, but to share the weight. For the first time, I truly felt like I belonged in his world, not as someone sheltered, but as someone standing shoulder to shoulder with him. In that meeting room, when one of the older men questioned my presence, Matthew said only one sentence, quiet but final: "She's the reason I chose to change." and the only one who can bring me back if I go too far." The room went silent. They understood. Because anyone who had ever lived in that world knew love was the only force strong enough to make a man like Matthew step back, and the only thing strong enough to keep him standing when everything else fell apart. After the meeting, when we left the restaurant, Matthew took my hand in his firm, warm, unshakable, a promise without words. I looked at him then and felt no fear, because I knew, whatever came next, we would face it together. No more distance, no more secrets. Evelyn was our bond. But choosing to stand beside him with full awareness and courage was what made me truly a part of him. Not just in peace, but in the storms that once seemed impossible to survive. And perhaps, in that very moment when I chose to step into the darkness with him, I finally understood what light really meant. Not a place without shadow, but the knowing that you are not alone when you walk through it. The rain began just before midnight, pattering against the eaves and brushing softly across the living room window like a melancholy lullaby. Matthew carried Evelyn out of her room after she stirred at the sound of distant thunder. She rubbed her eyes, then curled into his chest, her small body pressed against his dark t-shirt, her soft hair damp with sleep. The faint scent of milk still lingered on my collar as I sat beside them on the familiar couch. Matthew said nothing. He only kissed our daughter's forehead and looked out toward the yard, where rainwater had gathered in shallow pools beneath the maple tree. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the slow, steady heartbeat of the man who had walked through so many storms with me to arrive at this fragile peace. Within minutes, Evelyn drifted back to sleep, her tiny hand wrapped tightly around Matthew's thumb as if letting go might change the world. I placed my hand over his, and our eyes met in a quiet exchange that needed no words. Everything had finally settled, at least for now. The meetings, the strategies, the betrayals, they all seemed to remain behind that closed wooden door. What was left was only the three of us, and the sound of rain. I whispered that I never thought we would come this far, that there were nights I believed I would live forever in fear and unanswered questions. Matthew tightened his grip on my hand and said in that low, gravelly voice I knew so well, "I once thought I'd never deserve anything good, but then you came along not as light that erased the dark, but as someone willing to walk into it with me. You didn't run. You didn't judge." I let out a small laugh, kissed our daughter's forehead, and rested my head on his shoulder again. "I think she'll be better than both of us combined," I said. "Evelyn will grow up in a world where her parents chose to live decently, not perfectly, but honestly." He gently stroked our daughter's back and nodded. "I'll do everything I can so she never has to know the darkness I once lived in. But if someday she wants to understand, I'll tell her. I won't hide it. She deserves to know what we went through to find each other." Outside, the rain kept falling, each drop marking time in a steady rhythm. I closed my eyes and let the stillness of the night sink in, not the stillness that comes when everything is over, but the kind that comes when you've finally learned how to face it together. Evelyn stirred slightly in Matthew's arms, then settled again, as if she could feel the peace between us and knew there was nothing to fear. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment with the rain, the warmth of our little family, and a child dreaming her first dreams, I knew this was real. It was enough. It was everything. And perhaps, for people who had lost as much as we had, sitting together on a rainy night, watching our daughter sleep safely in our arms, was a victory greater than any power we'd ever known. I never thought a single rainstorm could change the course of my life. That night, when I collapsed on the roadside, wind howling and cold slicing through my thin coat, I didn't know that a stranger would be the one to bring me back. I had no idea that this stranger would become the father of my daughter, the first man to see me as more than an exhausted veterinarian, more than a woman who had lived so long out of duty that she'd forgotten how to love herself. There were so many times I thought I wasn't strong enough, that what I was clinging to was only the last fragile remnant of a youthful dream. I had grown used to loneliness, to endurance, to carrying myself through every storm without letting anyone see me falter. But then Matthew came unexpectedly, defying every logic I'd ever trusted. This man, with his shadowed eyes, quiet voice, and distant demeanor, was the only one who made me want to stay. From the moment I woke up in that unfamiliar mansion, I was wary of him. I thought he was danger itself. But the truth was, the most dangerous thing wasn't who he was. It was the sense of safety he gave me, something I had denied for so long that I'd forgotten it could exist. I remember his eyes the night I told him the truth about myself, about my diabetes, about my fear that no one would ever choose me if they knew the weight I carried. He just listened, silently, without turning away. And from that moment, he stayed. When I discovered I was pregnant, I panicked not because I didn't love him, but because I wasn't sure I could be a mother, that I could walk a path I had never prepared for. But when I was most lost, Matthew was calmer than I had ever seen him. He didn't make grand promises. He simply said, "You don't have to do this alone." And he kept that promise. Through every month of pregnancy, every morning of nausea, every sleepless night, every first contraction, he was there. Not always understanding, not always right, but always there. I remember the first time I saw Evelyn so tiny, so fragile that I was afraid to touch her, and the look in Matthew's eyes as he held her in the neonatal intensive care unit. The look of a man who would trade the whole world just to be in that moment. He had once been a name people feared, a symbol of power and control. But now, he was simply a father, a husband, the man who made formula in the middle of the night and whispered broken bedtime stories until our daughter fell asleep. I think of the times he returned to the shadows to protect this family, the nights he left in silence and came back with new scrapes on his hands, yet his gaze softened every time he saw me holding our child. I think of the first time I stepped into his world, not out of fear but by choice, when I told him I would no longer stand behind him, but beside him. I think of everything we've survived, the tears, the silence, the sleepless nights, the moments we thought it would all fall apart, and how we still held on to each other. If someone had once told me that a woman like me could find a man like him, I would have laughed. But now, watching Evelyn sleep between us, listening to Matthew's steady breathing beside me, I no longer doubt. I know this journey is real. Not perfect, not easy, but real. I am no longer the Claire I once was. I am the woman who has learned to love and be loved, who dared to stay, who became a mother, a wife, a companion to a man who once believed he didn't deserve the light. And if I could go back, I would still choose to collapse in that rainstorm, to let that outstretched hand pull me into a life I never imagined, but the only one I would never want to turn away from. That night's rain didn't just soak the streets, it marked the beginning of a journey neither of us could have foreseen. If not for that storm, Matthew and I might have remained two parallel lines in this vast city, each lost in our own world of quiet pain and invisible burdens. But fate had its own design, bringing us together at the exact moment when both of us had lost our way. Matthew was never a perfect man. He carried darkness, a past heavy with secrets and fears that few could ever understand. And yet, he was the first person who taught me what it meant to be accepted, to be truly seen, and to be chosen. As for me, someone who had spent years holding herself together so no one could see her weakness, I learned to let go, to stop controlling everything and allow love to find me. Together, we rebuilt our lives not through fairy tale dreams but through patience, courage, and faith. Evelyn became the living proof of that journey, a tiny soul carrying new hope and quiet strength. When I watch her laugh, when I see her take her first steps in the yard, I understand now that true love isn't about perfection. It's about walking through imperfection together and choosing each other anyway. This story isn't just about a simple woman and a man who once emerged from the shadows. It's a reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most bring us our greatest turning points, that a single rainy night can change an entire lifetime, that no matter what kind of past we carry, every one of us deserves love and healing. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lived through a moment that changed everything? Have you ever met someone who made you see life differently? We would truly love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, tell us what you felt, what you've kept inside, and help us create a space where everyone feels seen and understood. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving and meaningful stories we share every day. Every time you share, you help spread kindness and connection to more people. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We wish you good health, peace, and a life full of love, and may you always find light, even in your darkest days. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.